Peace and love, you beautiful wonders with a spiritual level of being. Nathan here from a spiritual level of being, and you have a spiritual level of being. And today we're going to be discussing the bloodline of Jesus. There's myths, legends, conspiracies, books, documentaries. There's also some historical sources. We are going to be discussing the historical sources, myths and legends. Now, let's begin with the historical sources. Now, Hegesippus of the 2nd century writes that the descendants of Jude, Jesus' brother, were living during the reign of Emperor Domitian. Now, Emperor Domitian was the Roman emperor. Now, Eusebius, who wrote the biography of the first Christian Roman emperor, Constantine, who was also a Christian bishop and a Christian historian, he also writes that the descendants of Jude were basically hunted down by Emperor Domitian as he ordered the persecution of the bloodline of David, as he feared the bloodline of David and he feared the second coming of Christ. He ends up capturing the descendants of Jude, and they explain to him that the kingdom of heaven isn't an earthly kingdom, it's an angelic one. So he lets them go in order for the persecution of Christians to stop. Now, Eusebius also mentions the descendants of Jude being killed for their faith by the orders of the Roman Emperor Trajan. Now, Eusebius, he mentions a descendant of Jude by name, and this name is Judah Kyriakos. Sorry if I butchered his name. He's also known as Judas of Jerusalem. He was also a bishop of Jerusalem. Now, we don't know exactly when, but he was active around 124 to 135, so dying around 135. Now, both Athanasius and Eusebius both describe Judah as being the great-grandnephew of Jesus. Now, what is interesting is after his death, he's replaced by a man named Marcus, who becomes the first non-Jewish bishop. So is this implying a takeover? So it's interesting as well that this Judas is also confused with another figure called Judas Syracuse, who is mentioning the story of the discovery of the true cross. This Marcus fella, who was the first non-Jewish bishop, he was elected by a council of bishops in Rome, none of which actually met Jesus. So this is what I meant before by a takeover, or possibly even a split from its Jewish origins and Gnostic and Essene origins. Now, before this, the early Christian movement was led by Jesus' family and his disciples, from which were in charge of their own towns or communities for spreading their message from community to community, to town. Now, the three figures that are said to have been loved the most by Jesus are Mary Magdalene, whose role was removed because she's a woman, and possibly Jesus' wife. There's also James the Just, Jesus' older brother in some accounts. Then there's John the Baptist, who Jesus said that there's none greater born of woman than John the Baptist. And Jesus said that James the Just, his brother, is to be the next church leader, or the next Christian leader, so the leader of the disciples, as he implies that heaven and earth came into being for James' account. Now, John the Baptist's role was possibly most likely changed on purpose with John the Apostle being replaced as the disciple he loved the most. Now, in these other accounts, it's Mary Magdalene, as a lot of the Gospel of John was stolen from Mary Magdalene, and also the Gospel of Thomas. So the early movement was led by his family. Now, both James the Just and Jude, Jesus' brothers, their descendants became bishops in their own right. It seems James the Just descendants were more of the top figures, and Jude's descendants took over after James the Just descendants died out around 329, though some of them also were bishops in their own right around the same time as James the Just descendants, most likely leading their own factions. Now, John, who was a son of James the Just, he had another son called Joseph Maha David. Both of these figures had descendants. Now, John had a son called Benjamin, who was the 6th bishop of Rome, and according to Eusebius, he was a Jewish Christian, most likely an Essene, Nazarene, or Ebonite. Now, he had a son who became the 7th Bishop of Jerusalem, and his name was John. Now, he had a brother called Levi, who became the 12th Bishop of Jerusalem, and he had another brother called Jude, who was the 15th Bishop of Jerusalem, and these were all the sons of Benjamin. Now, this being said, we have Joe's descendants, which were most likely or possibly killed during the persecution orders of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. Now, Joe's papa, or papas, was a bishop of Seleucia, and he died around 329, and this is where the line goes cold, and this is where it said that James' descendants died off. Now, if there were any women figures, such as Jesus' sisters, they weren't named, as back then women weren't so much as important unless they were of noble rank. Now let's go on into some theories. There's a Canadian Israeli journalist named Simcha Jakovici, who claims to have rediscovered the Jesus ancestral tomb that was discovered in the 80s. Now, he points out something that's interesting, that they have discovered Simon's tomb, who was the person who helped Jesus carry his cross, and on his sarcophagus the same marking was found on the so-called ancestral tomb of Jesus. Now, they found in these tombs markings of several names, such as Yeshua bar Yosef, which means Jesus, son of Joseph. They found Miriam, which means Mary, which is the mother. They found Yos, which is, well, Yosi, or Yosis, which is Jesus' brother, or meant to be Jesus' brother, and Miriamne, sorry I butchered that name, which is Mary, known as the Master in Greek, which is Mary Magdalene, and Matteo, which is Matthew. They also found Joseph's tomb in there, and there's supposedly, this is controversial, another tomb that supposedly belonged to this ancestral tomb that was taken away and then returned, which states on the sarcophagus Yaakov ben Yosef, James, son of Joseph. But what's the most controversial thing discovered in this tomb was the name Yeshuda bar Yeshua, which means Judah, son of Jesus. Now, some people link this story in with another man named Jesus Justus, who is mentioned by Paul as a Jewish Christian and as a fellow prisoner of Christ. Now, this theory is also elaborated on by a once Australian historian that was in the end rejected by many scholars because of her supernatural beliefs and views. And she ended up becoming an author. And she ended up mentioning about Jesus' son being Justus, or Jesus II. Now, the lady who I mentioned before, who used to be an Australian scholar, her and a couple of other authors elaborated on a con artist work written by Pierre Planted, who was a con artist, and he proposed that Mary Magdalene escaped after Jesus' crucifixion bearing his child. In some sources that have been elaborated on, it's either a daughter or a son or both, a daughter and a son. Now, this family apparently mixed in with the Frankish royal family, the Merovingian dynasty. However, this is all from this con artist that has proposed this, and other books such as The Bloodlines and Holy Grail and the Da Vinci Code have elaborated on this. Now, we have got myths and legends of reincarnations of Jesus being even his child, and this was supposed by the Canadian Israeli author and journalist Simcha Jakovici. So some of these claims are also modern ones. Now, there's some Jews and Muslims that believed that Jesus survived the crucifixion and that he fled into the Middle East and had a family, and there he died, preaching his same message. There's Muslims that believe that Jesus fled to India after the crucifixion, surviving it, and preaching in India until his death. Some accounts him having a family. Now, there's Muslims that believe that Jesus was raised to heaven by Allah to protect him from the crucifixion. Others that Judas was swapped with Jesus and it was merely an illusion. Now, this could have Gnostic origins, as there were Gnostics that believed this too. There were Gnostics that believed that Jesus was a regular human, that he was married to Mary Magdalene, and possibly had children. So there are ancient ideas of this belief. So it's interesting to look at all of this. So peace and love, everyone. I love you all. Connect to one mind and soul. Namaste.